The snow wasn't just falling, it was pouring out of a grey, unforgiving sky. It came down like ash, coating the empty main street in a blanket of silence. But the silence was broken, again and again, by the sharp crack of a leather whip. It was a sound that made you clench your teeth, a sound that cut right through the bone-chilling wind. And the man tied to the post, a man as broad as a barn door, he didn't make a sound. He just took it. His white hair was matted to his face with sweat and snow. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to a back that was already a road map of old scars. He was a giant of a man, but he stood there with his head bowed, taking the lashing like he was taking a spring rain. He'd learned a long time ago that making noise didn't help. It never did. But then a sound cut through the air that was sharper than any whip. A child's voice, small but clear, carried on the wind. "Papa." Just that one word, and the whole town went still. The marshal, his arm raised for another strike, froze mid-swing. The crowd, a mix of grim faces and curious eyes, stopped their murmuring. For a second, the only sound was the groan of the saloon sign swinging in the wind, a lonely, mournful creak. Everything else was stone silent, because in that one word, the whole story of this cold, bitter day had just changed completely. The widow, Sarah, hadn't meant to see any of this. She'd come to town for flour, for lamp oil, for the simple things you needed to survive a winter that was already trying its best to kill you. Her little girl, Lily, was already whining, stamping her small bare feet in the snow, begging to go home. But the crowd drew her in. In a town this small, you learned to notice things. You had to. She pulled her shawl tighter and edged closer, Lily hiding in the folds of her skirt. The faces in the crowd were a strange mix of satisfaction and fear. They were glad to see the big man punished, but they looked like they were watching someone try to tame a wolf. They weren't sure it would work. She heard the marshal's voice, flat and cold. "Caught trespassing again. Told him last time. He don't keep to the road, he'll answer for it." Off to the side, the town preacher stood with his Bible clutched in his hands, his breath making little white clouds in the air. He murmured something about the merciful being blessed, but he didn't move a muscle to stop it. He just watched. Then the lash cracked again. The giant's whole body shuddered, a wave of pure agony, but still he made no sound. He just sagged against the ropes. And that's when her daughter's voice ripped through the silence. "Papa." Sarah froze solid, every part of her turned to ice. The bag of flour slipped from her numb fingers, bursting open in the snow like a puff of smoke. She turned her head, slow, mechanical, toward her daughter. Lily had stepped away from her, and she was staring at the man at the post. She wasn't scared. She was looking at him like he was a king. Sarah reached for her, a sudden sharp panic rising in her throat. "Lily, no," she whispered, but the girl was too quick. She wriggled out of her grasp and darted across the street, right toward the whipping post, her little legs churning through the snow. "Papa," she cried again, her voice ringing with a certainty that made no sense. The marshal's face twisted from confusion to pure irritation. "Whose girl is that?" he barked, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sarah felt every one of those eyes land on her. She swallowed, her throat as dry as dust. "Mine," she said. The word felt like it belonged to someone else. It was just a weak little croak in the wind. But the giant heard it. He lifted his head. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head, and his eyes, pale and cold as creek ice, found hers. And in that one look, 10 years just evaporated. They collapsed like a rotten fence. She knew that face. Under the wild beard, under the white hair, under the ruin of a decade, she knew him. It was him. And he wasn't dead after all. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes asked the only question that mattered. "What are you going to do?" The whole town was waiting. The marshal was waiting. Her little girl, who had stopped just short of the post, was waiting. A word pushed its way out of her mouth before she even knew she was thinking it. "Untie him." It came out quiet, but it landed like a stone in a silent pond. The marshal just stared at her. "He's due his punishment, Sarah." She took a step forward, putting herself between the marshal and the post. "I said," she repeated, and this time her voice cracked like the whip, sharp and loud, "untie him." You could see the surprise on the preacher's face. The crowd started murmuring, shifting their weight. Nobody wanted to cross the marshal, but nobody wanted to argue with a widow defending her child in the middle of a snowstorm either. The marshal let out a string of curses under his breath, then gave a sharp nod to his deputy. The ropes were cut. The giant swayed, his body finally giving in, but he didn't fall. He pushed himself upright, slow and deliberate, towering over everyone. His shoulders were slumped, not from the beating, but from a habit that seemed older than the town itself. "You'll take him?" the marshal asked, his voice full of disbelief. The question hit her like a punch. Take him, into her small cabin, into her life, a life she had carefully, painfully rebuilt from ashes. But then Lily ran to him, burying her face in his soaked, dirty coat, her small arms trying to wrap around his massive leg. Sarah looked at her daughter and then back at the man who was supposed to be a ghost. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper. "I'll take him." The marshal wiped his hands on his pants as if he was wiping away the whole mess. "Then he's your trouble now. Town won't feed him. Town won't house him." Sarah just nodded, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. The man still hadn't said a word. She gathered her spilled flour, tied her parcels back onto her small sled, and with a jerk of her head, motioned for him to follow. He did, his footsteps leaving deep, heavy tracks in the fresh snow. The crowd parted for them, their whispers following them like ghosts. As they reached the edge of town, she glanced back. The preacher was watching from the church steps. He gave her a slow nod, but she couldn't tell if it was for pity or for blessing. When she turned back, the giant was closer than she expected. His shadow fell over her, long and dark in the fading winter light, and for the first time she heard his voice. It was low and rough, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. "You didn't have to." She kept her eyes on the path ahead, on the dark line of trees that marked the way home. "Maybe not," she said, "but I couldn't let her cry for a ghost." He didn't say anything else after that. There was only the sound of the sled runners on the snow and the howl of the wind, promising a storm that would hit long before they ever made it home. The walk back to the cabin felt like it took a lifetime. Every step was heavy, weighted down with everything they weren't saying. The snow was coming down harder now, catching in the giant's white hair and beard until he looked less like a man and more like some ancient spirit of winter. Lily, bless her stubborn little heart, refused to let go of his hand. She trudged right beside him, her small boots disappearing into his massive footprints. Sarah stayed by the sled, her jaw so tight it ached, her own thoughts roaring louder than the storm. She was walking home with a dead man. A man she had mourned, a man she had buried in her heart years ago. And now he was here, solid and breathing and bleeding, and she had no idea what to do with him. When they finally saw the faint, welcoming light of the cabin, she felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled her knees. She hurried inside, lighting the main lantern, ushering Lily toward the warmth of the stove. The giant stopped on the threshold. He just stood there, his huge frame completely blocking the doorway, silhouetted against the swirling white storm. He looked like a shadow that was afraid to come into the light, as if crossing into her home would trap him in a life he didn't know how to live. "You'd better come in," she finally said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The storm will be worse before dawn." He had to duck to get through the door. He moved carefully, as if afraid he would break something, and went to stand by the fire. Steam started to rise from his wet coat as she stoked the flames higher. He didn't take the coat off. Not yet. She tried to busy herself with normal things, hanging Lily's wet shawl, putting the parcels on the table. But she could feel his eyes on her the whole time. It wasn't a prying look, just a presence, a weight in the small room that hadn't been there an hour ago. Finally, she had to turn and face him. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, and it felt like touching an old wound, one she had convinced herself had healed over. A question slipped out before she could stop it. "You're supposed to be dead." A corner of his mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was something much sadder. "Supposed to be," he echoed, his voice still rusty. "A lot of things were supposed to be." Her breath hitched in her throat. She remembered him from before, tall, yes, and quiet, but there was a hope in him then. A gentleness that had made him so easy to love. She'd waited for him. She'd waited until waiting felt like a fool's game. until the loneliness was a constant ache in her bones. She'd waited until another man, a good man, a steady man, had offered her a life, and she had taken it because you can't build a home out of maybes. "Where have you been?" she asked, the question tasting like rust and regret. He looked away toward the flames. "Gone," he said. It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. Just then, Lily, who had been watching them with wide, serious eyes, toddled over and climbed right into his lap. She did it without asking, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The giant's whole body went rigid. He looked down at the small child curled against his chest, completely baffled. But he didn't push her away. "She doesn't remember her father," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "He died when she was just a baby." The giant looked at her, then back at the sleeping child. "I'm not her father," he said, but his hand came up almost on its own and rested on Lily's back to keep her steady. "No," Sarah agreed, a strange tightness in her chest. "But she seems to think you are." He just stared down at the little girl's head, at the way she snuggled against him, and his expression changed. It was a look of such fierce, broken tenderness it almost made Sarah look away. But before anyone could say another word, the cabin door creaked open. It was Martha, her neighbor from down the road, her face red from the wind. Her eyes went from Sarah to the giant, and then back again. "He's staying here?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "For now," Sarah said, her back going ramrod straight. Martha sniffed, pulling her shawl tighter. "The town won't like it. Folks will say you've got no shame." Sarah's chin lifted. "They already say that." Martha's gaze flickered to Lily, fast asleep in the giant's lap, looking safer than she had ever looked in her life. The neighbor's righteous anger seemed to falter. "Well," she huffed, "I suppose it won't make much difference then." And she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her, leaving a cold draft in her wake. The silence she left behind was heavy, filled with the judgment of the entire town. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and sank into a chair at the table. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. The giant finally, carefully, shrugged off his heavy, wet coat. He laid it over the back of a chair, and she couldn't help but see the dark, angry welts the whip had left across his back, stark against the damp fabric of his shirt. There were other scars too, old ones, faded white, that told a story he obviously wasn't ready to share. He finally broke the silence. "I didn't ask you to take me in." "You didn't have to," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "She asked for both of us." His gaze flickered from her to the fire and back again. "You'll catch trouble for this." A small, bitter smile touched her lips. "I catch trouble for breathing," she said. For the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It might have been humor. It was gone so fast she couldn't be sure. They sat there, saying nothing, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the stove. After a while, Lily stirred. The giant moved with a surprising gentleness, lifting the sleeping child and carefully laying her in the small trundle bed near the hearth. He tucked the quilt around her, his scarred, massive hands looking strangely delicate. Sarah watched him, and that old ache in her chest came back, sharper this time. She couldn't tell if it was grief for the past they had lost or terror for the future she had just invited into her home. He stood up and went to the door, not to leave, but just to look out the small window at the storm. The snow was a blinding, swirling wall of white. "If you want me gone in the morning," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it over the wind. "Say so now." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, and Lily sighed softly in her sleep. After a long moment, Sarah got up and went to stand beside him. Together they looked out into the endless, raging darkness. "You can stay," she said, her voice just a whisper. "But only until the storm passes." He gave one slow nod. It wasn't the nod of a grateful man. It was the nod of a man accepting a sentence, a man who knew that kindness always came with a price. And outside the wind howled louder, as if to remind them both that some storms take a very, very long time to pass. The world was quiet when she woke up. The storm had buried everything in a deep, muffling layer of snow. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. He was already awake. He was sitting on a stool by the stove, just staring into the flames as if he could read a story in them. Lily was still asleep, a small lump under the quilt. Sarah moved around the cabin quietly, the way she always did, her bare feet finding the familiar floorboards that didn't creak. She lit a lamp against the grey dawn and looked at the man who seemed to take up all the air in the small room. He wasn't just big, his silence was big. It filled every corner. "Did you sleep?" she asked, her voice low. He just nodded once. She slid the coffee pot toward him. "There are beans in the jar if you want to grind them." He stood up, and for a second she'd forgotten how tall he was. He unfolded himself until his head nearly brushed the wooden rafters. She took an involuntary step back, not because she was afraid, but because a memory hit her out of nowhere. Dancing with him at a town social all those years ago. Her head had fit so perfectly right there, tucked under his chin. She turned away quickly, pushing the memory down before it could hurt. He ground the beans without a word, the slow, rhythmic rasp of the mill the only sound in the cabin. The rich, dark smell filled the air, a small, comforting thing in a world that felt anything but. She set out 3 cups. She wasn't sure if it was habit or hope. When the coffee was ready, he poured her a cup first, then one for himself. He left the third one on the warming plate for Lily. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a crack in the wall of silence he had built around himself. They drank their coffee without speaking, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't tense anymore. It was waiting. By noon, the sun was trying to break through the clouds, and Lily was wide awake. She was a whirlwind of energy, chattering away, tugging on the giant's sleeve. She wanted to show him her most prized possession, a small, crudely carved wooden horse. It was the last thing her father had made for her before the fever took him. The giant took the little horse in his huge, calloused hand. He held it so gently, turning it over and over, as if it were made of spun glass. "She doesn't usually talk this much," Sarah said from her chair, where she was mending a tear in Lily's dress. "Not to strangers." He glanced over at her, his face impossible to read. "She's not afraid of me." "No," Sarah said softly, looking at her daughter, who was now insisting he get down on the floor with her. "She isn't." And to her utter amazement, he did. This mountain of a man, with whip marks on his back and a history of violence in his eyes, got down on his knees on the rough wooden floor. He helped Lily build a little corral for her horse out of kindling sticks. It was the most ridiculous and the most touching thing she had ever seen. She watched his hands. They were scarred and battered, the hands of a man who had known nothing but hard labor and harder fights. But the way he placed each tiny stick, so carefully, so deliberately, it was almost like a prayer. When she got up to get more wood for the stove, she saw his shirt hanging to dry by the fire. The dark lines of the whip marks stood out against the pale fabric. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Who was this man, really? What had he done to earn that beating? And what had he become in the 10 years he'd been a ghost? She knew one thing for sure. The town wouldn't let this go. And right on cue, Martha showed up again that evening. She stomped the snow off her boots on the porch and came inside without knocking. She slapped a loaf of heavy dark bread on the table, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. "Folks are talking," she said, her voice flat. "They always are," Sarah replied, not looking up from her mending. "They say he's dangerous. They say he'll bring trouble down on this house." Sarah's needle paused. "The storm's not over yet, Martha." Martha sniffed, her eyes darting nervously toward the giant. He had gotten to his feet the moment she'd come in, and now he stood silently behind Lily, his shadow falling over both of them. There was something about his stillness, something powerful and immovable, that made Martha's certainty waver. "Well," she said, her voice a little less sharp now, "you do what you think is right." She left as quickly as she had come. The moment the door closed, it was like the whole cabin could breathe again. Lily broke the silence. She held up their finished corral, giggling with delight. "It'll hold," the giant said. His voice was quiet, but for the first time there was a hint of something else in it. It sounded almost like pride. That night, after Lily was asleep, they ate stew in near silence. But it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something else, something deeper. She noticed he ate slowly, deliberately, like a man who wasn't used to having enough. "You can talk, you know," she said, the words surprising her as much as him. He put his spoon down and finally, really, met her eyes. "I don't have much to say that's worth hearing." You could tell me where you've been." He thought about that for a long moment. Then he slowly shook his head. "Not yet." Her throat tightened. "Then tell me this," she pushed, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you ever come back? Why didn't you look for me?" His jaw worked, a muscle flexing under the rough beard. "I did," he said, his voice raw. "I did look. And when I couldn't find you, I heard you'd married. So I stayed gone. It seemed kinder." Kinder, the word hit her like a slap, as if 10 years of not knowing, of grieving a man who wasn't even dead, was a kindness. As if building a new life on the foundation of a lie was a gift. The wind kicked up outside, rattling the shutters, and the lamp on the table guttered, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. She felt a sudden desperate urge to tell him to leave, to send him back out into the storm where he belonged. But the words that came out were different. "You can stay," she said, her voice small and tired. "You can stay until the road is clear." He nodded once, but the look in his eyes told her he knew the truth. The road between them was more blocked than any snow-covered pass. That night she lay awake for hours, listening to the floorboards creak as he kept watch by the dying fire. Sometime deep in the night, Lily murmured in her sleep. She tossed and turned, her little hand reaching out, not toward her mother, but toward the chair where the giant sat, a silent guardian in the dark. And Sarah saw it. In the faint orange glow of the embers, she saw her daughter reaching for a ghost. And she felt something in her own heart reach out too. She didn't know if it was fear or hope, or maybe, just maybe, they were the same thing. The storm didn't let up. For 3 more days, the snow kept falling, burying them deeper, cutting them off from the rest of the world. The little cabin started to feel less like a shelter and more like a cage. He was always there. He didn't talk much, but his presence was a constant, solid thing. He spent his time fixing things. He rehung the sagging barn door. He patched the leaky spot in the roof. He chopped enough wood to last them through the next blizzard, stacking it in neat, perfect rows. He worked with a slow, relentless rhythm, as if he was trying to rebuild his own life, one repaired hinge at a time. Sarah found herself watching him. He moved like a man who had been alone for a very long time, a man who had forgotten how to share a space. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he would stand at the small cabin window and just stare out at the white, empty landscape. He looked like a prisoner staring at a wall, or maybe like he was searching for a road that would let him disappear all over again. On the 3rd night, the wind finally died. The silence it left behind was so complete it was almost deafening. They were sitting at the table, Lily asleep in her bed, when he finally spoke. "They took the ranch," he said. His voice was so sudden, so quiet, she almost didn't hear him. She turned from the stove, the ladle still in her hand. He was sitting with his huge hands clasped on the table in front of him, like a man trying to hold himself together. "While I was gone," he said, his eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table, "fighting their war. They sold it, piece by piece, said I owed taxes, said I wasn't there to claim it." Sarah put the ladle down and sat across from him. So that was it. He'd gone to war. He'd come back a hero, probably, and found nothing. He'd come back to a home that had been stolen out from under him. "You could have fought them," she said softly. "I did," he said, and his voice was flat, empty. "I fought until fighting felt like begging. Then I left." She looked over at Lily, curled up and sleeping peacefully, and she felt a surge of anger at the world that could break a man like this. "Where did you go?" "Everywhere. Nowhere," he said, letting out a long, slow breath. "Worked on other men's ranches, took whatever jobs I could find. It's not easy for a man with no land, no name. After a while, it was just easier to be a ghost." She looked at his face, really looked at it. She saw the new lines etched around his eyes, the hard set of his mouth. The easy hope he used to have was gone, burned away by years of wandering. "You should have come here," she said, the words aching in her throat. He finally lifted his head and met her gaze. His eyes were tired, so tired. "You were married, Sarah. I had no right." No right. The words were like stones. He had no right, but she had spent years building a life on the ghost of him. Before she could find the words to answer, a sharp, heavy knock rattled the cabin door. Lily startled awake with a small cry. The giant was on his feet in an instant, moving between them and the door. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. She opened the door a crack. It was the marshal. His coat was covered in ice, his face grim. He didn't look at her. He looked right past her, at the giant. "Storm's clear," he said, his voice hard. "That means your guest has no more excuse to linger." "He's done nothing wrong," Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended. The marshal's eyes narrowed. "This town doesn't need a drifter, Sarah. The man's got a reputation. He's a brawler. He's trouble. You want him, you can have him. But don't come crying to us when it all goes sideways." And with that, he turned and left. The cold that flooded into the room had nothing to do with the weather. The giant hadn't moved. He was just a statue carved out of shadow and silence. "You heard him," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I did." "They'll come for you," she whispered. "If you stay, they'll come for you." He gave a single, slow nod. "Then I'll go." The words were a punch to the gut. After all this, after everything, he was just going to leave. A cold fury rose up in her, pushing past the fear. She slammed the door shut and faced him. "You could go," she said, her voice low and tight. "You could walk out that door and be a ghost again. Or you could stay. But if you stay, you have to stop hiding, from them, and from me." He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then he reached into the pocket of his worn coat. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, soft and creased from being handled 1,000 times. He laid it on the table between them. "This is all I kept," he said. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. It was a drawing, a charcoal sketch, rough and smudged, but she knew it instantly. It was her. He had drawn it the night of the winter dance, the last time she had ever seen him. Her hair was down, her smile was shy, and there was a look in her eyes. A look of pure, unblemished hope. A look she hadn't seen in her own reflection for 10 years. "You carried this," she whispered, her throat closing up. "Everywhere," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just then, Lily padded over and climbed into her lap, her sleepy eyes peering at the drawing. "That's Mama," she said with a delighted little gasp. The giant looked at his daughter, at their daughter in everything but blood, and his voice was filled with a reverence that broke Sarah's heart. "Yes," he said, "it is." Outside, the world was completely still. The storm was finally, truly over. But the quiet inside the cabin was different now. It was charged. It was fragile. It was buzzing with a possibility that terrified her. "You could stay," she said again, her voice softer this time, "but not as a ghost." His pale eyes locked with hers. "If I stay," he said, his voice low and certain, "I stay for good." As if to seal the promise, Lily reached her small hand across the table and took his massive, scarred one. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his, holding on tight. Sarah watched them, the drawing clutched in her other hand, and she knew. She knew what the town would say. She knew the trouble it would bring. She knew the risk. But for the first time in a decade, she felt the flicker of that same hope she saw in the drawing. And just as that feeling began to settle in her bones, another sound broke the stillness. The crunch of horses' hooves on frozen snow. A rider coming fast. The giant stood up, every muscle in his body tense. "They won't stop coming," she breathed. He moved to the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame, a protector once more. "Then we'll decide what to do," he said, his voice a low rumble, "when they get here." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and a dark shadow fell across the window, blotting out the pale moonlight. They were here. The horse was reined in so hard it snorted and stomped, its breath pluming in the frigid night air. Sarah's hand shot out, pulling Lily behind her skirts, but this time she didn't feel afraid. She felt a cold, hard resolve settle in her heart. Before the knock could even land, the giant pulled the door open. The wind whipped in, carrying a flurry of snow, and framed in the doorway were the marshal and 2 other men from town. Their faces were set like stone, their hands resting on the butts of the pistols at their hips. "You've had your charity, Sarah," the marshal said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And he's had his mercy. Time's up. He's gone by dawn, or we make him gone." The giant didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a mountain in the doorway, his shadow swallowing the flickering lamplight. But it was Sarah who stepped forward. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice was as steady as the northern star. "You want him gone?" she asked. "Then you'll have to take me and the child too." The marshal frowned, thrown off balance. "This isn't about you, Sarah." "Oh, it's about me," she shot back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You send him out into that cold. You send us with him. Because I will not stand here and teach my daughter that compassion is a crime and mercy is something to be afraid of." The words hung in the freezing air, sharp as icicles. One of the other men shifted on his feet, his gaze dropping to the small girl peeking out from behind her mother's dress. He wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. The marshal's jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had come expecting a fight from the giant, not from the widow. "The town is afraid," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "A man like him, he just draws trouble." "He draws breath," she corrected him, her eyes blazing. "Same as you. Same as any of us." The marshal stared at her for a long moment. He looked at the giant, standing silent and resolute. He looked at the child, holding tight to her mother. And then something in him just broke. He let out a long, weary sigh, the fight draining out of him. He tugged the brim of his hat down low and turned back to his horse. "Do what you want," he muttered over his shoulder, "but don't come crying to me when this town turns on you." The three of them mounted up and rode away, their hoofbeats fading into the vast, silent darkness, leaving nothing behind but the hiss of the wind through the pines. For a full minute, nobody moved. Then the giant closed the door. The final soft click of the latch sounded like a promise. He turned to look at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said, her voice full of a sudden, fierce joy. "I did." Lily, freed from her hiding place, scrambled over to him and wrapped her tiny arms around his leg as tight as she could. "Don't go, Papa," she whispered, the name no longer feeling like a mistake. The giant knelt down, his whole massive frame folding until he was at her level. He rested his rough hands on her small shoulders, his touch impossibly gentle. "I wasn't planning on it," he said, and his voice for the first time was soft. The snows finally melted. The world turned from white to brown to a hopeful, tender green. And he stayed. He didn't talk about the past. He didn't make promises about the future. He just was. He worked from sunup to sundown. The fence that had sagged all winter now stood taut and straight. The barn roof was patched and solid. The woodpile grew into a small mountain, a fortress against the next winter. He moved through the days with a quiet purpose, and Sarah watched him, not with the longing of a lonely woman, but with a kind of quiet wonder. He was still a man scarred by a hard world, but here, on this small patch of land, it was like he was slowly, carefully, piecing himself back together. One evening, the setting sun was pouring liquid gold through the cabin window. He came in from the fields, his face streaked with dirt, and washed his hands in the basin by the door. Lily was at the table, humming to herself as she set out 3 bowls for supper. He stood by the fire, drying his hands on a rag, watching them. "There's a cattle drive starting up north soon," he said, his voice casual, not looking at her. "Good money, they say. Enough to maybe get a man a steak again." Her hands stilled in the stew she was stirring. "You're thinking of leaving?" He turned then, and his pale eyes met hers across the small room. "No," he said, "I'm thinking of staying. For real this time. But a man ought to be able to put something on the table if he's asking to stay." Her heart did a little flip in her chest. "Who said you had to ask?" He looked at her for a long, searching moment. It was a look that held 10 years of silence, of loss, of maybes and what-ifs. Then he crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and stopped right in front of her. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the honest scent of earth and sweat and wood smoke. "Then I'm not asking," he said, his voice a low rumble. She thought she should feel trapped or scared. Instead, she felt a knot in her chest, a knot she had been carrying for a decade, finally begin to loosen. That night, for the first time, it felt like a family. Lily chattered on, and he listened, really listened, his eyes flicking over to Sarah's face every now and then with a look of quiet contentment. After supper, he went outside to split a little more kindling for the morning. She followed him out onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool evening air. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a steady, comforting sound in the twilight. "You could have gone, you know," she said into the quiet. "You had every reason." He stopped, sinking the axe into the chopping block and leaning on the handle. "I've been gone long enough," he said. The last rays of sun caught in his white hair, turning it to silver, and she let herself imagine it, not just for a night or a week, but for always. Him here, with them. When he came up to sit on the porch step, she brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside him. The night was peaceful, the only sound the distant call of a coyote. "I can't promise you much," he said after a while, his voice low. "Just a strong back and a roof that won't leak. And a man who won't run again." She looked at him. She didn't see the broken drifter tied to a post. She saw the boy she had danced with, the man who had carried a drawing of her through a decade of hell. She saw home. "That'll be enough," she said softly. Just then, the cabin door opened and Lily padded out, barefoot and sleepy. Without a word, she climbed right into his lap and curled up against his chest, her eyes already drifting closed. He held her, his big hands gentle as he smoothed the hair back from her forehead. Sarah watched them, this giant of a man and her tiny daughter, fitting together like they were always meant to be. And her heart, for the first time in so long, was completely steady. This was it. It wasn't a grand promise whispered in the dark. It was stew on a wooden step. It was the smell of freshly split pine. It was the quiet, unspoken understanding that they had found their way back. And maybe that's how a real family is made. Not with words, but one small, hard-won kindness at a time. If you were moved by this story, let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart. Thank you for watching.